Okay, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar, Preserving What's Left Behind, Specialist Memorials Conservation at Willesden Jewish Cemetery. Thank you so much for joining us. Tonight we'll be hearing from Hester Abrams, project leader of the House of Life at Willesden Jewish Cemetery, and Ben Newman from Cliveden Conservation, who's been doing some of the conservation work here at the cemetery. I'm sure you'll be aware that Willesden Jewish Cemetery has recently opened with a new visitor experience. So you're all very welcome to come visit, and we'll share information about visiting with you later on. This webinar is part of Open House London. So thank you so much for joining us for this event tonight for Open House London 2020. Just so you're aware, if you have any technical issues, please do put them in the chat. I'll be there to respond if you need any help with that. If you have any questions for the panelists, for Ben and Hester, please put them in the Q&A and they will respond to them at the end of the session. Thank you for joining us, and I will pass over to Ben and Hester.
Thank you very much, Emma. I'm Hester Abrams. I'm the project leader at the House of Life Heritage Project at Willesden Jewish Cemetery in northwest London. I've been working on this project for nearly 5 years, and I've also kind of become the curator. So in this talk with Ben from Cliveden Conservation, we're going to be mixing a discussion of how the project that we're involved in, which has been very much supported by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and the United Synagogue, the owner of the cemetery, how this project has worked to conserve some very interesting memorials. And the conversation, which is probably going to last, we're not entirely sure, but maybe 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes with an opportunity for questions, is going to mix quite in-depth look at a handful of monuments and memorials with sharing some of the stories of the people who they remember who are buried there. And we're going to run it as a conversation between me and Ben, and I'm going to be asking him questions about the conservation and also updating on the biographies and the stories of the people. So I hope that is an interesting format and that it will prompt questions, as Emma has suggested. The timing of this talk comes, as Emma has said, just as a new visitor experience has opened at Willesden Cemetery, and also just as Cliveden Conservation is bringing to a close its work on 6 monuments funded by our grant from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. We very much encourage you to come, and at the end you will see our website address where we would love you to sign up for our newsletter to find out more. During the lockdown, we have actually moved to presenting more events online, and while it's quite possible to come and visit the cemetery, we're not doing public programming in situ, but more online. So I'd like to introduce my colleague and a conversation partner tonight, Ben Newman, who has been leading this project at Willesden. He's a project manager for Cliveden and a stonemason by expertise. Ben, Cliveden has been involved with this project actually since 2017, when you first came to do a survey looking at the condition of the monuments and making some recommendations. What would you say is kind of the significance of this project, and what can be done for a landscape like this? I'm just going to show everybody a few pictures. This is the cemetery which opened in 1873, and you begin to see some of the scale of it. But if we just look at some of the memorials, Ben, what would you say can be done for a memorial landscape like this?
Well, yeah, hello everybody. I'd like to say that it's been a pleasure working at the cemetery. And a look at my background is I basically have an art school training, but I'm a stonemason by trade. So I have a thorough understanding of traditional stone buildings, but it's coupled with a kind of appreciation of the artistic background, and I'm also a SPAB fellow. So with all my projects, I try to have a balance between conservation, craft and art. And the cemetery itself is a wonderful structure, and is a little overwhelming with the state of some of the monuments. So they're quite, dilapidated, some of them. but we had a project to do 6 monuments, and we tried to approach it very much on an individual basis. And so it really fantastic, some kind of works of art in themselves. So, and the approach is to kind of maintain their historic, because we didn't want to over clean or anything. So because you want to respect their historical integrity. And also it's kind of balance between aesthetic cleaning and the structural stability of them. So yeah, it's a very, very nice, interesting project to work on. I don't know whether you want to say something, Esther, about how those 6 monuments were chosen.
Oh, yes. You ask me questions too. Let me see. I've got another couple of slides just showing a little bit more of the environment. I mean, as we're saying, it's 27,000 graves, or nearly 27,000 graves, from 1873 to August 2020. It's still an active burial ground, and it's a registered landscape. Those of you who are knowledgeable about conservation and gardens and parks will know the Register of Parks and Gardens of Special Historic Interest. And this is the only Jewish cemetery in England to be on it, largely because of the significance of the landscape of memorials, which are, I think you've probably already seen, quite, in some cases, elaborate. They're made out of many different materials. They span, of course, several centuries. And there's a lot that we could say, but we possibly are not going to cover today, about the styles of them and their symbolism. But yes, how did we come to choose 6 monuments out of 27,000? The landscape itself has several different character areas, and there is the original what we call the old ground, which was laid out by the architect Nathan Solomon Joseph, who was the architect and surveyor to the United Synagogue in 1873. And the Central Avenue, I'll just go back, the Central Avenue that I've just shown you was actually, that's his original layout. And in fact, on the left here, you can see 2 chief rabbis from the 19th century, and this was the most prestigious avenue on which to be buried. How did we choose this number, handful? Well, of course, cost is obviously a driver. I think it's really important to say that many of the memorials here are modern, and they are made by memorial masons. They're made to a much more standard set of designs for a number of reasons. And we're really talking about some of the distinguished monuments in the old ground. We were looking for a combination of aesthetic or architectural merit and biographical significance. So we're going to talk in detail today about 4 of them, and we mentioned the other 2 that were chosen. And of the 6, 2 are listed. One of them, in fact, the first one we're going to talk about is not actually listed, but the ones we've chosen in many ways are unique. So Ben, what would you say? You said it's kind of overwhelming, and a lot of the grounds is actually quite dilapidated. I mean, this is true that a very, very small number of the graves have a family to look after them. They belong to the families, and the United Synagogue is the custodian of the grounds, but can't intervene unless there's a health and safety reason. So what would you say generally if you were given a blank slate? You know, what on earth can be done when there's a space this big with this much need? Oh, sorry, that was an alarm that went off. I beg your pardon.
I don't think that's me.
No.
Yeah, I think first of all, the structural integrity of as you say, the health and safety issue is paramount. The first thing we look at is how structurally sound they are, and if there's any interventions which are needed to make them more stable. And then the cleaning aspect, I think, is really important to bring out the best aesthetic qualities with them. And then, so we try and take a minimal approach. So always starting with a series of samples to find the best methods to clean them. And as I mentioned, we don't want to over clean anything. Marble is quite a problem because it gets quite sugary in our damp atmosphere. So you need to be careful and not use too much pressure, etc. when you're using various forms of cleaning. But I think, yeah, to maintain the aesthetic quality of the cemetery, I mean, it's a wonderful, peaceful place, and to keep it in a good state where you have a balance with its historic benefit, but also halting the natural erosion over time that these monuments suffer from. So we're kind of trying to slow down that natural erosion to give them as much life as they can take, but without, you know, over cleaning and having an over intervention to make we don't want to make them new, because part of their quality is that historic age that they have, really. So I think that's very much where I come from, to look at the cemetery as a whole in that way.
I think you remind me to make the point that Ben, you and your team are not the only people working on looking after these memorials and monuments, but because of our grant, we were able to bring you in as absolute specialists to take the particular kind of care and attention that we're going to talk about. The cemetery has its own grounds team, led by Arthur Mehuto, who is the foreman here, and there's a very small number of graves that are still that have a regular maintenance program, largely because there is just, this is the burial ground of a community that is not the same size, that it has moved on. And as I said, there are very few people who actually even know where their grandparents are buried. So I'm not sure that they would be still keeping up a kind of cleaning or maintenance contract on those memorials for that number of years. So, but everything that is being done is making a difference to the quality of the landscape and the ability for future generations to come and appreciate it. Could you say something about the difference, before we move on to the specifics of some of the particular memorials, could you say something about the difference between conservation and restoration? Because I think a lot of people think if you get a grant, you're going to just kind of wave a magic kind of wand and you're going to put all the headstones up and you're going to restore it to its former glory.
Yeah, I mean, that touches on the philosophy of repair. So restoration would be, I guess, in many people's eyes, to restore monument back to how it would have looked when it was originally built. That's something we try and avoid to do, because I don't think in a way that respects the passing of time and that patina of age that a monument will gather over time. It, you know, gives it that kind of charm and stateliness, I think, which is very important in a historic cemetery like Willesden. So yeah, we try and conserve. So as I mentioned before, we're trying to slow down that natural process of aging, and have a good balance between repairs that are absolutely needed to prolong the life of the monument, but also and improving its aesthetic look, but not being kind of too heavy-handed, not having a one kind of set of kind of parameters to suit every monument. You know, every monument is going to have its different needs, so it's a sensitive approach to evaluate what that particular monument needs to suit it to its best way of presenting it to going forward, you know, to hopefully so it will last for many more years. That's really our kind of philosophy.
We have never talked about it, but I actually very much like that word, sensitive. So let's share with our audience some of the detail. In fact, I've been holding on this particular slide just because it's a particular view of the cemetery, and it shows this kind of classical temple, and it is indeed one of the first ones that you were working on. This is a monument to the Samuel and Edgar family. This is I'm just going to show a sequence, which is, this is how it looks now after the work that you've done, and it's a view from the side and from the back. Actually, on the left hand side, it's the back, and you can see the grave of the most recent burial, which was 1972 in that plot, of Gilbert Edgar, CBE. This is the family of jewellery makers and clockmakers, and on the other side are three headstones of a mother and two sons, and the mother is Harriet Samuel, whose name is probably not familiar to you, but is familiar if we say to you that she is H. Samuel of H. Samuel, the High Street Jewellers. She was the wife, the widow and the daughter-in-law of a father and son clockmaking business in Liverpool. And first the father died and then her husband died, and she took over the family business. It's a story of kind of incredible success, because her sons joined her and then grandsons, and then after she died and several generations took over, by World War II there were hundreds of stores of H. Samuel around the country. It's not actually it's not owned by the family anymore, it's actually owned by Signet Jewelers, but amazingly there is this something I think I've called the most blingy monument in the cemetery. And let's have a look at what you were doing with it. Tell us what the challenge was here, Ben.
So the challenges with this monument were twofold, really. So there's quite a lot of soiling, as you can see in the frieze with the blackness, and a lot of and within the capitals itself, a lot of sulfation that's caused by acid rain and over the years of a polluted environment. But also there was some a little bit of structural movement, which we were sort of concerned about, and all the joints were very much open on the top of the cornice and the upper part, the portions, and on the steps themselves had been looked like quite a lot of groundswell had caused the steps to spread a little bit. So we put a scaffold up around this, and it's always interesting to get up close to a building or a monument like this, and you can kind of see the construction at closer hand. So we used a pressure and steam cleaning system, which effectively brought the marble to quite a nice clean finish, with, you know, being careful, because the trouble with marble in our quite damp and wet environment is that it tends to go sugary. So the matrix of the marble, it loses its kind of bond with the materials that make it up, and the surface can be quite sugary, and you lose a lot of that surface. So it's important to use not too high a pressure, but we use a steam cleaning system, and that heat, it can go up to 150 degrees Celsius. So that helps to bring it up to a nice clean without relying on just the pressure of more sort of traditional pressure cleaners. With the sulfation, we used an ammonium carbonate poultice, which initially we would mechanically take off, because the build-up that you can see in the capitals can be quite a thick sulfation of possibly 20 mil in the worst cases, and that can damage the stone by not allowing the stone to breathe. So salts build up behind and can mechanically break down the surface of the stone. So it's very beneficial to remove that blackening, and also beneficial on an aesthetic level. So I mean, I think this monument in particular, being such an impressive scale, is quite a landmark within the cemetery. So cleaning it as we did, I think, it's really seemed to have very good effect. The structural side, as I mentioned, we repointed all the open stonework at the upper levels, and we had various structural engineers which gave their opinion. And as a kind of, we were confident, I think, after examining it closely, that the movement was fairly historic and it was an active movement, so it's not about to fall down. But as a precaution, we put some stainless steel dog cramps in the back of the upper sections, just to stop any further spread of that stonework that might occur. And in the lower sections, we realigned a lot of the steps, just to aesthetically really to bring the thing together, and again repointed everything. The mortar you use for stone is a hydraulic lime mortar. We do use a more traditional hot lime as well, but with the harder marble, we thought the hydraulic lime mortar was the best material. And it's not quite as hard as cement, although you've got to be careful with how you use that. But that gives a good bond with the surfaces to fill up the joints and to stop the ingress of water. Yeah, there you can see on that photo some of the displaced stones of that plinth course. So that was all pointed up and made weather tight. So yeah, I mean, it's a very satisfying process to go through these measures, and it's fascinating to work with buildings like this, because it's a beautiful building, classical design. And very satisfying to stand back and see the end result. So also on the structural side, we put some telltales up there just so it can be monitored over the years to make sure that if there is any subsequent further movement, that can be properly monitored. But it seems in a good state of repair now.
And we talked earlier about the fact that on the steps is actually the mark of the stonemason that made it. And neither you nor I could remember this afternoon who it was, but I think it's M. Van Rijn. And if it is, that means it was made by one of the foreman or the superintendent who was based at Willesden, and in fact lived in the building that I'm broadcasting from, which is the lodge and now the visitor centre. There was a father and son. The first one was Henry Van Rijn, and his son Maurice Van Rijn took over. Henry was the superintendent for I think more than 50 years. This is about 1900. We haven't actually said, but it's probably around the early 1900s. It's unique in the cemetery, as you say, a landmark. And I do think it's quite remarkable that obviously at that time, much of the cemetery was grass, wasn't actually filled up. But it is remarkable that something of this craft was actually built for the community, for this cemetery, actually from the people on site.
Yes, it's always fascinating seeing the kind of maker's marks, as you might describe them, of the memorial masons. And obviously at that time there was a lot of skill around that was used in building general. But yeah, the monuments are very nice because they're almost like miniature buildings in themselves. So they have all the skill that would go into the magnificent buildings going up in the 19th century, that area. But as almost like a little jewel, a little work of art in themselves. So I like that genre of work in the monuments.
And I should say that it's not a tradition in a Jewish cemetery for there to be mausolea or indeed crypts. Everybody is buried. The body is placed in the ground. The headstones that you can actually see within this monument are actually relatively standard and relatively plain, but they obviously, got some dispensation to put this extraordinary structure over the top of them. There are family plots in the cemetery, but they're more like little gardens with railings or enclosures. So this, in its way, is really quite unique. So let's move on to number 2 of the 4 we want to talk about today. And this is yet again another architectural or aesthetically different one with its own conservation challenges. Yes, here we go. This is the memorial to a man called Emmanuel. This is how it now looks after the work that Clifton Conservation has put in. What would you like to tell us about this, and what were the challenges here? Well,
as you say, it's very unique within the cemetery, being of this wrought iron construction. It's a fascinating piece in itself. And we brought in a specialist, Alex Code, who's an expert in metal. So it was quite, so the original colour that was going to be painted was going to be black, but it was the way we, as I mentioned, we like to approach everything as an individual object. So we both, Alex and myself, both kind of thought that the black is going to really kill it, and he thought that the grey would work very well. And so with the conservation officer on hand, we agreed with him that we could change the spec of the colour. And I think it works very well within the cemetery as a whole, because I think the black would have really deadened it, and legibility of the lettering wouldn't be so good. And really, I think it blends in very well. Again, sticks out very well in that colour.
So shall I just say a little bit about, it's possibly not that easy to read, but one of the distinctive sort of biographical or historical things about this memorial is you can see the man's name, Emmanuel. I should also say that his wife, it says, and Julia, his wife, is also buried there. Emmanuel died in 1898 and she died in 1920. So we can surmise that this dates from after 1920. The kind of interesting historical thing about this is something which really captures the whole stream of Anglicisation among the Jewish community of the late 19th century in London. It says, Emmanuel, a good Jew and a good Englishman, beloved by all who knew him, and that he was the secretary to the Board of Deputies for 45 years. He was a solicitor, and this is actually an extract from one of the extensive, long newspaper articles in the Jewish Chronicle, which was the community's weekly newspaper, in June 1898 when he died. And unfortunately, it was a slightly farcical, but actually also very tender description of what happened when he died. He was there on a Sunday handing out annual prizes to the Hebrew school, the religion school at Old Ford, and he had finished out giving the prizes when he came feeling faint, and his wife was called. And when she came to the school, she said, it says here at the bottom, who had been sent for, Mrs. Emmanuel, who had been sent for, on approaching the school after he had ceased to breathe, thought that she saw her husband in the playground and that all was well. As I say, he was a solicitor, and from what I've read, he appears to have been one of the first Jews to be admitted as a solicitor early in the, I think, 1830s and 40s. And so he was extremely useful to the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which was the representational organisation of the Jewish community with government. And he was also a founder of the kind of one of the youth movements called the Jewish Lads Brigade. We don't know very much about his descendants, except that we have found 6 or 7 generations down that the people who are contemporary to us, who are descendants of Louis Emmanuel, are also artists, which I think is very interesting, given the artistic nature of the memorial. But we don't really know why it was made. And I'm now taking you back to what it looked like before Cliveden came. Ben, tell us a little bit more about the process of conserving this metal.
Yeah, so we took a sort of minimal intervention approach to this one. So there were some, we repaired some of the rusted pieces which were almost kind of disintegrating and at risk of falling apart. So where it needs to be, we brazed it to give it coherence, and then removed, wire brushed all the decayed metal so that a primer could be applied to it to kind of halt the rusting and to kind of preserve it in this state as it is at the minute. So it's got its own qualities, hasn't it, in that rusted state, and, which is quite ominous, isn't it? Really, that photo's amazing.
Well, it is no more like that, and
the risk with that is that it's, with time it would very soon fall apart. So the important thing was to stabilise the condition of the metal.
Yes, and I think what I've noticed walking around the grounds with this one and the Samuel Edgar monument is that after you've cleaned it and after you've done these different processes, these things are lighter. They're kind of ethereal. They're hanging in the air, and you can see them in their environment, and they're sort of less lowering. You could see from the steps of this Edgar monument that looked like pavement, that this whole thing looked like it had elephant's feet. But what's happened with this is that it has almost shrunk into its own shape. I mean, actually, here you're just showing some images of the rusting, the deteriorated edging, and the kind of the foldings of the scroll. Let's quickly go back to what it looks like now. I mean, you can actually see the shape of it. It's a sort of arts and crafts style with this shield. I mean, we don't know why this memorial was chosen. We don't know, what its provenance is. We don't know who made it. But some interesting things. Just tell us what Alex found.
So Alex found some traces of some gilding and some black paint, and so hence the original intention to paint it black. But then as we kind of got into starting the work, it struck Alex that the black wasn't maybe the most appropriate thing to use, because he's got quite a good knowledge of historic metalwork, and he said that black wasn't really widely available as a colour painting metal until kind of about the 1930s. So the black that we found was probably a later addition to another intervention, maybe from the cemetery, to halt the rusting a little bit further. So I think the grey is a lot more sympathetic possibly to the original design. Alex thought there may be some traces of some galvanised finish on it. So that's an interesting way it might have been finished, and kind of ties in with the arts and crafts style, as you mentioned, Hester. So yeah, it's a very, very nice piece of work, and I think it's shown to good effect with that colour. It kind of really lifts it, especially on a sunny day. It really, again, is another kind of beacon in the cemetery, actually, being such an unusual design.
A beacon in a slightly different way than how it was before, but we definitely we really admire the kind of before and after on this. Anyway, there's more to say about that, but we will save it. Perhaps people will have questions. We'll move on to another one. I'm just going to roll back through these other images, and this is the tomb of Maximilian Eberstadt. This is one of the listed graves in the cemetery. And I'm going to say a little bit now, perhaps a little bit more than in the other instances, about who Max Eberstadt was. And the answer is we really don't know very much about Max Eberstadt, but we do know a lot about his sister and brother-in-law. Right next to this tomb is a huge kind of chest tomb, complete with, well, it's actually the remnants of some copper detailing on the outside. And in that, underneath that chest tomb, lie husband and wife, George and Elizabeth, later Sir George and Lady Elizabeth Lewis. George Lewis was possibly the foremost criminal solicitor of Victorian England. His clients included Edward, Prince of Wales. His wife had an incredible artistic salon at their house at 88 Portland Place. And they were so well known to politicians and artists, musicians, writers, that and also, you know, painters, that their portraits were painted by John Singer Sargent. And on the right is a small photograph which shows Elizabeth and her twin brother Max and their parents and brothers in Germany. Their father was the mayor of Worms, possibly the first Jewish mayor of a German town. And Max is right on the edge. He's leaning slightly forward. He's got a cravat, and he's got his elbow crooked, and his sister is just sitting in front of him. So Max Eberstadt came to London when his sister came to London and married Henry Lewis. And all we know is that he was a very cultured man, and that he was the secretary to Sir Ernest Cassel, who was a financier and banker, also of German origin. But Max unfortunately died young. I think he died roughly at the age of 40. And in the cemetery, you see lots of symbols. The monuments or memorials to people who died young are often a column cut off midway, or a tree trunk cut off. And on Max's tomb, you have the same idea, but actually in a very decorative way. It's a branch which has been cut off from the tree. And in this case, it's been done as a roundel, which I know that Ben will talk to us about. This is what it looks like now. Max, the little that we know about him was that he was, a fairly artistic person. And I'll just read you the last few lines of a sonnet that was written about him by a poet, John Payne, to Max Eberstadt in Willesden Cemetery. So this is evidence that people knew this grave was there. It says, my thought to that sad January day goes back of half a score of years ago, when underneath the newly melted snow, the last of that bright wit was laid away, etc., etc. And at the end it says, Max, shall I never talk with thee again of all we loved and none enough but we, of Dickens, Dumas, Gautier, Peerless Three, Liszt, Wagner, Schopenhauer, woe is me. And that tells you the kind of milieu that they were in, whether they knew these people or whether they enjoyed their work. Here is a photograph that was taken by Historic England. It's actually in one of their publications published this year, showing it from above. And it's an extraordinary, simple design with the roundel in the middle. Now I'm going to pass over to Ben, really, to sort of talk about this design. The one thing we haven't yet said is that it was actually designed by an artist itself. And the artist was Edward Burne-Jones, who was a friend of the Lewises. This is the drawing, which is in the possession of the Aberdeen Art Gallery, for the grave of Max Eberstadt. And this has been in the collection, in fact, on the website of the Aberdeen Art Gallery for a long time. And it was only really when we started this project and we found this in the Aberdeen Art Gallery's collection that we were able to say this grave is in our cemetery. So it's an incredibly exciting series of discoveries that have led to this work on the tomb. Ben, what can you tell us about what this is made of and what you had to do?
Yeah, so a fantastic piece to work on. I really enjoyed this piece, and probably my favourite of the 6 monuments that we were conserving. And unusual in the fact that it is listed, as you mentioned, and designed by such a prominent artist. So yeah, I mean, if you could you go back to the high resolution photo?
Yes, that one.
Yeah, so this is where we sort of started, and it was quite an involved process. So as I mentioned earlier, we always start with a series of small cleaning trials to see the best way forward.
Sorry.
So there's a kind of amazing patina that's built up with age. I don't know if yeah, there we are again. So, and this is partly, you've got this kind of swirling effect in the bottom right hand corner, which is due to the fact that the whole tomb kind of leans that way, so that as the water and the rain washes off it, you get this natural accumulation of dirt, which is quite dramatic, so, and quite kind of romantic in its way. So, but as we started cleaning it soon became apparent that, you know, we'd go down a path that was going to take us away from that. And bearing in mind this is a work in progress, because the inscription is very deteriorated, and the flush lead lettering is been, there's a lot of losses, so it was felt important to reinstate the inscription. So that's in the process of being remade. So the cleaning has to be a kind of balance, because you can imagine you're going to have new marble inlay around the edge, so that gradually we cleaned it to more kind of level of cleanness, but as I said, important not to over clean. So it's a beautiful piece. The actual ledger itself is made of granite, and it's tooled granite. So as we cleaned it up, there's a gradual process of cleaning. If you could go forward, Hester, could you go to the? Yeah. So if I can go to the next one with gusset. So this unusual mark there is caused by some iron staining, which again, it could have been, I don't know what that shadow is. It could have been maybe a stone was there, as in the Jewish tradition of laying a stone on the grave as a remembrance. But something must have been there to kind of leave that shadow. But there's a lot of iron staining, so we use various different forms of poultice. And this is quite a clever one, because you can see it acting over time with a change of colour. So as the iron solubilizes and kind of goes into solution, then it's able, the poultice, the body of the poultice is able to suck out that iron staining. You can see in the last one that you've got, it's kind of more back to the granite there. So that was our kind of sample. So we realised that it was working really well, and we just need to make sure that we're not overusing it, so that you maintain some of the granite's natural aging. But in cleaning that, you see different things in the granite, and I think part of the artist's intention was to have the contrast with the colours. So the granite is sitting on top of a green base. Could you go back a little further, actually, Hester? There's
one before this one.
Yeah, one before that, and before, I think, even before, I think the first one possibly. Yeah. So yeah, the base it's not very well shown in this photograph, but there's quite a colour contrast. So the base is actually a green igneous rock, not granite itself, and then you've got the granite on top, and then the white marble. So the carbon staining you can see on the side, we had to, because granite is such an impervious, hard material, we used a micro abrader with an abrasive, which you wouldn't normally do on limestones or marble, because those stones are just too soft, and you'd risk actually taking off the pattern of the stone. But with granite, you can use dry abrasive thing just to remove that surface carbon deposit from pollution, basically. And in doing so, you see the texture of the stone, the tooling, which really brings it out as a kind of, you know, work of art, the piece itself. And bearing in mind, you know, balancing it with the new marble that will go in all around the edge. But the real feature is that the roundel in the middle, which is a beautiful piece just in itself. So that was a pleasure to work on. And actually, during the cleaning process, you can see we almost kind of, so it's kind of reversed. It's almost a negative image of what it was originally. So that the actual branches themselves are lead inlay, and they have they've got a kind of the way they weather it, they have a white powdery finish. So that went back to the more greyness of the lead, and then it was quite an involved process because the blacks. I mean, you can see the marble is absolutely black with an organic staining. So we gradually had to come up with a regime of cleaning that would get through this, and the middle one serves a kind of halfway process. So initially we used a little micro steam cleaner, which sterilizes that organic growth. And then through a series of, first we used a citric acid, which is very mild, but in fact we had to use a stronger poultice in the end to bring it back to the white finish. But yeah, it's a very striking piece. And yeah, you know, just to remove that organic iron staining and the blackness in the top right hand corner, just sets out that design very well, I think, and shows it off as it was intended to have been seen. I think so.
And I think you told me this afternoon that if you look on the left, the one on the left, how you click to it, there's actually a long piece of the branch is missing, and that you were able to put that back because of the missing pieces that I'd collected in a biscuit tin.
Very diligent of you. Yeah, so it's very nice to have those missing pieces. And the way that this would have originally been flush lead, so they would have actually carved the sort of reverse image of the branch within the marble, and then they would drill a series of holes, and the lead would be beaten into the channels that were formed. So it's a very interesting traditional memorial process. In fact, the lead is now raised, so you do get raised lead lettering in monuments, but the marble itself has kind of weathered back probably 2 or 3 mil even, left the lead proud, so the lead is quite impervious to it doesn't react with other chemicals so well. So
okay.
So it's interesting, and yeah, I had, with a little jeweler's hammer, I was able to boss back to make sure that it had a good adherence to the marble, and we were able to replace the missing pieces. So nice, yeah, very nice it was very satisfying to do that. I enjoyed that.
Fabulous. Okay, let's move to the fourth of the 4 we want to talk about. This again, I think we've called this a mini temple. It's close. This is a side view, but it's visible from the front of the cemetery, from the visitor centre, and all we know is that it's a monument to a man called Henry Nathan, who died in 1927. And I think this picture doesn't show it. It's actually now a picture as it is now. But I think one of the distinctive features that one can see when you go past it, apart from the fact that it's quite different from everything around it and it's close to a tree, is that it's leaning slightly alarmingly to one side. So a little bit of biography. In the case of this monument, we do not have a current connection to any family member related to this monument. And so when work was about to start, when you were about to start this work from Cliveden, we put out some notices saying the work was about to begin, and if anybody knew of anyone, could they please get in touch with us. And we didn't quite get what we expected. Through a combination of my own mad Googling on the internet and somebody who came forward from the Jewish community who is an avid family history researcher, we've been able to construct an extraordinary story about this person and his monument. We're not entirely sure of all the details, so I'm not going to give it all away. Also, we don't have much time. But in fact, what's interesting about this monument is not Henry Nathan, but his widow. So here is Henry Nathan's death certificate, and this is actually a piece of evidence that we do have. It said on the grave, Henry Arthur Nathan, who died on, I think, the 15th of November 1927, aged 60. And in fact, it said who passed over rather than who died or anything. And it says my beloved husband, but it doesn't name the wife or the widow. This death certificate says that he was a manufacturing chemist who lived in Belsize Park, in the street Belsize Park. And his death was witnessed by somebody, J. van der Elst. We have subsequently, in working to find out more about the story behind this monument, we've actually found a woman called Violet van der Elst, who in the 1950s or even before was known as a significant campaigner in Britain for the abolition of capital punishment. And she was, in fact, there she is making a public affray and I think being arrested yet again. She was actually present at the hanging of Ruth Ellis. But the interesting thing about her is that she is Violet van der Elst. She was married to Henry Nathan. She was, I think, his scullery maid, and she was 13 years younger than him. Together in their life, I think in the 1920s, she became a millionairess for having invented a brushless foam called Shavex. So when it says he was a chemist, an industrial chemist, it looks like he may have had something to do with that business. Anyway, they had a lodger who was a Belgian artist, Mr. van der Elst. And when Henry died, she married the lodger and became Mrs. van der Elst. He then died a few years later, but she'd made such a fortune. She bought a country pile, which is now called Harlaxton Manor in outside Grantham in Lincolnshire. And anyway, her story is very interesting. But if indeed she is the husband of Henry Nathan, and we're not entirely sure, although I did speak to her great nephew who said, yes, her husband was Henry Nathan. So we're still finding out more, and we would love to find the descendants. Sorry, they had no children, so it wouldn't be descendants, but it would be descendants of family members. Richard Gilbert, who volunteered to help do the family history research with me, found that actually there are many siblings of Henry Nathan in the cemetery. Indeed, his mother is buried, who we believe to be his mother, is buried in the same row. So, and she was his father was a cigar manufacturer, which was quite a common trade or business for Jewish families to be in the 19th century. Anyway, enough of bizarre stories. Ben, what can you tell us about the work that you did to this memorial?
Yes, so similarly to the other marble monument, it was a kind of combination of steam cleaning and ammonium carbonate poultice to remove the heavy soiling and carbonation in you can see on the underside there. So that came up quite effectively. Something I should have mentioned earlier, yeah, we also used a product called Algo, which kind of sterilizes the stone from organic growth, and then will inhibit that in future when you get that greenness that you can probably see on the left-hand column there. I mean, the structural issues are quite obviously very noticeable, but it's a very confined site, as you can see from the photo. It's got monuments all around it. So to really address that, you'd either be looking at underpinning it or possibly taking it down and rebuilding it. Now, we made an assessment with structural engineers that it was stable, and that movement is historic, and it was considered that, you know, considering the cost and the difficultness in confined site, it was better to monitor it over years to make sure that it's okay. So really, it was just a cleaning project to make it aesthetically more desirable, and also, as I mentioned before, that sulfation can have quite a damaging effect on the marble, makes it and speeds up that kind of sugaring effect that it can have. So by taking that sulfation off, the thick black crust, you enable the marble to breathe, and it can dry out more effectively and prevent that salt damage building up behind the surface and breaking down the surface of the marble. So yeah, interesting, unusual monument again. I mean, maybe at some stage it will be decided that we can rectify that lean, but at the moment we've decided that we'll monitor it, and it'll be good for a few more years. But fascinating history behind it. It's really good research you've done there, and I mean, part of the nature of the monuments is that the character of the people that they're designed to remember it's a really nice synthesis between architecture and history and the characters behind them. It's fascinating.
Well, I think this begs the question: why is there this kind of elaborate bird cage or whatever it is in the middle of rows? This is actually, you can see the sort of the relative simplicity of the graves around it, behind in particular. They're all around 1905, those other ones. And what would have happened is that if he died, without his wife, the wife was still alive, she clearly wasn't Jewish, he would have been brought back to the place where his family was. But the fact that Richard Gilbert, the researcher, found that he came to the cemetery and looked at all the places where his siblings were, but that there is I can't remember her name, but her maiden name was Elkin. Mrs. Nathan, maybe Esther Nathan, née Elkin, is about 6 or 7 graves along in the same row. It shows you why that space was chosen, and the things that we've subsequently discovered. Again, I'm quite tentative. I mean, it would be wonderful if it was true, and I think it probably is true, but I don't have it's only circumstantial evidence to put it together. Suggests that his widow was such a character that, she had a lot of money, and she decided, my darling husband needed, I'm bereft without him, and I will put this monument up, even if it's not the vernacular that the Jewish community does. Anyway, 2 more monuments, very briefly. Let's just quickly look at and just acknowledge the work that Clifton has done on 2 other ones. So this was a different type of project because it's a family enclosure. This is the only picture we've got. Again, the work in progress. I should simply say that there are maybe 6 or 7 flat tombs in there, and the only one that looks like it's of any biographical note is to I think it was Arthur Vivian Nathan Neville. The whole family were called Nathan Neville, and Richard Gilbert, our researcher, suspects that this Nathan Neville family may in fact be related to the Henry Arthur Nathan family. Arthur Vivian was awarded the Légion d'honneur from France for his involvement in organising a state visit to Britain by French President Poincaré in 1916. And it also says on his tomb that he was the church warden of All Hallows, Lombard Street, a church in the City of London that no longer exists. I understand that being a church warden doesn't mean that you ring the bells in a church. It's actually a kind of honorary role in the Corporation of the City of London. However, we've not been able to find any descendants. It seems that he's buried with his parents and sisters and 1 brother who didn't have any children. So there's a lot of mystery about the biography. But what was the work? It's still going on, Ben, but what's the work that you've been doing on this monument?
Well, yeah, this is a different material. So the monuments inside are all polished granite, so actually very little work was needed there. But so the work really concentrated on this surround, which is in a limestone, unlike the marble and granite that we've seen before, and it's a Ketton stone, which is fairly soft. So again, there's a lot of sulfation, particularly picked up in the decorative carved elements. So again, we use the ammonium carbonate poultice to remove that, and again, the steam cleaning was made quite a substantial difference to the appearance of the stone. As you can probably see, there's a number of trees within the curtilage of the monument, and the roots had quite extensively gone on this left-hand pier on the right-hand photograph. So we took that all the way down right to the ground level, realised that it was the roots that was causing this pier to kind of lean over, removed that and then rebuilt that pier with the ball finial on top, and basically repointed everything, this time in a hot lime mix because of the softer stone. We thought that was appropriate, very traditional lime mix, just to make kind of filled up any water traps to prevent, stone, the further decay of the stone through water ingress. So just that kind of process of cleaning and making sure that structural stability was reinstated. So yeah, and there'll be some new ball finials to reinstate. So we'll come back and finish that off.
And I should say also that there are a number of family enclosures that look like this, also complete with their own horticulture. They look like little gardens in the cemetery. And this one is to the right of the funerary buildings if you face the buildings from the entrance. It is true that the structures of some of the enclosures are at risk because, whereas in the 19th century, a family may have paid a down payment as a capital sum for the cemetery to maintain everything within the plot. These days, really, the only options are to look after particular graves. And so as a project, and the United Synagogue has to think about how we encourage those families who do have a connection to come and make a contribution to sort of raising the level of the care and conservation of all of the environment, not just individual tombs. And finally, we're calling it the Roseberry Rothschild Mausoleum. It is actually the remains of a mausoleum. There was a building here over a pair of tombs. You can see the pair on the left. The one closest to us on the right is the daughter, Hannah Roseberry, Lady Hannah Roseberry, who was the daughter of Mayor and Juliana de Rothschild, who are in the enclosure on the left. And she died aged 40, leaving 4 children, I think in 1890. And her husband commissioned a mausoleum to be built over the whole thing. So the floor is actually an original internal floor, the tiles that you can see. And as I said, it suffered a direct hit in the Blitz, in the bombing in World War II. And a few years afterwards, the United Synagogue pulled away the rubble and did not rebuild it. But what you're seeing is something very ornate, and they're all marble. So what did you have to do on this one?
Well, on this one, there was originally there were some bronze grills in those square sections, which caused the verdigris staining on the lower sections of the marble. So we used some poultice to try and reduce that. But verdigris staining from bronze is notoriously difficult to get out. So we kind of went as far as we could with that, and so that was not something that we could get back to the more natural marble finish, but there is an improvement with it. And then structurally, we rebuilt some of the coping sections which had been a bit displaced, and again repointing. So the repointing was quite a challenge actually, because the aggregate that you were using a mortar is in this country the limestones, but managed to get some quite coarse marble aggregate that was kind of cut up in a pin mill. So that produced a really good mortar actually.
Wow.
Very sympathetic to the stone. So I was pleased with that. Again in a hydraulic lime mix. So as I said, every monument has, we treat it as an individual project. So it's nice to come up with solutions which are particularly apposite to that problem.
Absolutely. Well, Ben, I think this has just been an amazing excursion into the world of what you've called sensitive conservation. And I think the cemetery and its current and future visitors are very lucky in a way to have been able to have this care and attention paid to some of the only a few of the really extraordinary features of this cemetery. I really like the way that you talk about the marks of time, and certainly the number of times that I've walked around the cemetery, and it must be hundreds, it is really, this monument is at the end of that avenue that we saw at the beginning of the presentation, and it's really a time capsule. It's where time stood still, and I think spending half an hour really getting lost wandering around this memorial landscape is really transporting. And I think this cleaning of these monuments has actually has honoured them, and also really honoured their makers, because this is an extraordinary craft. And again, I don't really want to forget the grounds team and the Burial Society at the United Synagogue, which really does a fantastic job against all of this time, and with very limited resources. And we really encourage anybody who has a family memorial that they would like to have taken care of, to come, to get in touch and to think about the different ways in which these memorials can be handled. I'm going to sort of just leave our contact details and open to questions. I've not been able to see what questions people have thrown in, but I think Ben and Emma can help.
Yes, there's a question from Ian, who wants to know what the ground condition is like. Is it London clay? It's a good question, actually, and I believe it is very much clay, and that's quite pertinent to the first memorial that we saw, because, as I mentioned, the Samuel Edgar family monument, which was the large classical one, had quite a lot of groundswell, so possibly some of the graves within the ground had maybe decayed and that things had fallen in a bit, but it very much seemed that there was some lateral movement in the steps in there, and that's probably, that could have been the heave of the clay. So I think the water, talking to Arthur, who Hester mentioned, the foreman on site, that in common with many London cemeteries, the water table is very high there, so that can be a problem when graves are dug, etc. Then there's, I'm just looking at the questions here. Yes, so there's a question from an anonymous attendee. Is there a protective coating that can be used to protect marble and other stone surfaces from further sulfation in the future? Yeah, you can. I mean, in the past, many stones have been treated with surface treatments. It's now generally considered that that's not the best thing to do, because you don't really want to seal that surface. You want to let the stone breathe, as it were. So in the past, by kind of sealing the surface, you can actually accelerate the decay, and the decay will stay within the stone, and the interior of the stone can decay from within. That can be quite catastrophic. So generally, we don't like to coat any surfaces. You can use like a lime wash, which is what you might call a sacrificial coating, which will eventually weather away with age, and that can offer some protection to very friable surfaces. But yeah, the sulfation that you get is not so profound now, because it was largely built up from our history of having so many coal fires, and that kind of pollution really accelerated acid rain, which leads to that heavy, thick sulfation crusts that you find on stones and marbles.
Yeah.
Now there's okay, so the next one is from Claire Van Zee. I'm from Johannesburg, South Africa. How do you look after marble in a hot, dry environment? We're trying to conserve project 100+ years old, statues, marbles and granite headstones.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I think marble behaves similar in most environments. I mentioned it in context to our wet environment because it doesn't particularly weather well. It kind of, I think, aesthetically, it tends to go very dark and doesn't look so nice. And probably in a hotter environment, you're going to have less of that soiling effect. But I don't think that's really makes a lot of difference to the way you may consider it. So, worst case scenario, marble can completely lose its matrix. So that sugariness quality that comes with decay can actually lead to the whole marble just losing all coherence, and it can just turn to a kind of marble dust, worst case scenario. Luckily nothing was like that in the cemetery, but I know that there's a technique that we kind of plasticize the marble. In Germany, in the Sanssouci, they put these marble sculptures into a vacuum bath and kind of pumps them with plastic. So you're replacing the natural matrix with an artificial one. That's a very extreme kind of conservation, but hopefully, you know, with gentle cleaning, that sulfation can be removed and just to leave the stone as it is, really, and that's the best kind of policy, really.
So Ben, we've got about 5 minutes maximum.
Right.
You want to choose some questions, or tell me, because I can't see them. Tell us how many questions.
Yeah, so I've got one, the poultice that we used on the branch element. So yeah, that was, we used a number of things, but the thing we used was, let me have a look. It's a hypochlorite, which is a little bit like 10% solution, a little bit like bleach, but bleach has a problem that can leave damaging salt crystals behind. But this was a very mild solution which broke down that organic staining, as I mentioned. So I've got another one. Is it possible to treat mold-prone areas with antifungals to prevent regrowth of mold? Yeah, the treatment we use with the algo it's a biocide, but again, it's quite an environmentally friendly biocide. It breaks down readily within water, but that does break down and kill that kind of organic growth, and will give some protection, you know, for a few years to come. But you possibly would want to do it, you know, sort of 4 or 5 year cycles.
There's a question.
No, yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, it's lovely to see the drawings by Burne-Jones with the red background. No, that I don't think there would have been any pigmentation to the marble. I think that was a kind of interpretation with the different. I think that the different contrast in the colours of the monument was definitely effectively used, but probably not translated in the watercolour that you saw there. That was from the Glasgow Museum.
Emma?
There's a question here that I think would be relevant to Hester. Fascinating what you said, if I heard correctly, that there are no family mausolea in Willesden. These were such a common feature of Jewish cemeteries of the same period in Central and East and Central Europe, also in Italy. Any reason for this that you know?
Oh, that's very interesting. I too have seen that. I've seen the Victorian Jewish cemetery in Mantua in Italy, which is, I think, from 1868, and ours is 1873, and it looks like the older brother or sister of ours, complete with avenue with hedges, and the Tahara house, the mortuary, which is actually currently used as a garden shed, with exactly the same kind of tiling on the walls. I really don't know. I mean, this is, you know, a fantastic area for exploration in its own right. The different kind of vernacular building types and headstones and memorials. I mean, you can come and visit Willesden Cemetery and see the modern part of the cemetery, and it doesn't look anything like any of these. Other Jewish cemeteries, you know, people put photographs on within the headstones. That's not the custom here. I don't know, and there's a sort of evolving. My understanding of the Roseberry Mausoleum is also evolving. It wasn't the custom, but it looks like from some rabbinical decision, it was decided to put a mausoleum over Hannah Roseberry, who had married a non-Jew. Her husband, the Earl of Roseberry, became the Prime Minister a few years after she died. Anyway, just, you know, there's more biography, and in fact we showed a photograph, but it's quite a recent photograph, but it didn't show the information panel that we've now put there. So if you come, you can read a bit more about it. Maybe one more question.
Maybe one question that's good for both of you, from Jason Lowe, who also works on the project. Can you identify any particular lessons learned from this work?
Ben?
That's a good question. I mean, yeah, personally, it's been a fascinating project to work on, and I think it just illustrates how complex a project like this can be. So every monument has its own individual needs, and it's coming up with the best kind of way to address those problems. And the cleaning is, very, very involved and very complex, and it's prone to, because we always, as I said, keep saying, you don't want to over clean. So it's having that skill and experience to really know what kind of materials to use to the best effect without overdoing it. So it's been valuable experience working on the variety of materials. And as I mentioned, the Eberstadt memorial is a fascinating work because it's almost like a work of art in itself. And I think I got a lot out of that and put a lot of effort into the various chemicals and ideas we used about it. So, and it's the first I mentioned about the little micro abrasive. That's the first time I'd used that piece of equipment, and I thought it worked very effectively, very controllable, because dry abrasion is very prone to overdoing it. But this machine was so controllable because it was relatively low pressures. That's something that I would like to use in the future, actually, because it's got a very good application for in the right situation and right material. So
I'd like to just add one thing to that, which is that perhaps we didn't make clear that the work on the Eberstadt monument isn't quite finished, and we haven't yet taken, obviously it's not done, but it has a Hebrew inscription and an English inscription, and because Hebrew is written right to left, that inscription starts at one side of the rectangle and goes to the other side, and where it meets the English starting. So when it's completely finished, and we are, as you're saying, you're going to be remaking some new lead lettering to inset in a new piece of marble. That it's still a work in progress, and we invite people to come from a few months' time later on in the autumn to come and admire it, or indeed come and see it now and come and see it in a few weeks' time. If there's time, I'll just simply say that the lesson I would draw from this is that it's not surprising that all these monuments require individual attention, because they were made by individual families for people that they loved and knew. And I would say that the lesson that if there's anything I've learned from it, it is that this, any cemetery is a repository of life, and it's a repository of stories. But also when we are standing where we are looking back in history, it's really a way in which a community and the people who live nearby can come and kind of collectively put their arms around something, and around the intangibles as well as the fabric of what's left behind, and really say, we do care about this, and we learn from it, and we're sort of grateful to the relics and everything that's been left behind. So I just think there's lots to learn, and I think it's just fascinating, the mixture of the conservation and the stories. So Ben, thank you very much. It's been amazing, and we welcome everybody to join our newsletter and come to the cemetery and see the work, and in various ways come and contribute to continued conservation of this rather special place.
Thank you, Hester. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Ben. I just want to say thank you to Ben and to Hester, but also thank you to everyone who has joined, and thank you for all your questions. I'm so sorry for the few people who didn't quite manage to answer all your questions. So wonderful to have so many people ask such interesting questions. Do feel free to continue the conversation. You've got the email addresses of Ben and Hester there. If you'd like to get in contact with them to ask a question, please do feel free. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.